So hydration is one of those things which you typically hear quite a lot about. You hear people say you've got to stay hydrated, and if you get dehydrated then your performance is going to suffer. And in this video we're going to break that down a bit. We're going to talk about hydration, whether it's actually important, salt in your electrolytes, how much you might need to drink. We're going to go over all of it. If you've got any questions by the end, then as always just let me know in the comments and I'll answer it for you and help you out. So what's up nutrition heads, and welcome back to another video. If you're new here, my name's James, and on this channel we talk about all things related to nutrition and triathlon. This is part of my triathlon race nutrition series, where we cover all sorts of videos to help you race faster. If you haven't already, then click the subscribe button to stay up to date whenever I release a new video. Now today's video we're going to focus on hydration in your average triathlon. We're not going to cover super hot triathlons because that is a bit more niche and there's more that I can say on that to help you out. But if you're watching this and you have got a super hot one coming up, the principles will still be the same. It may be that you just need to add a little bit of salt or consider your fluid intake a little bit more. But listen on, because even if that's you, you will still find some handy practical tips in this which you can use for your racing. Now we are just talking general advice today because actually hydration is really personal. And if you want to take it seriously, then you do have to experiment a bit and practice to know really what works for you. And you need to work out what your priority is. So is it hydration or is it carbohydrate intake? And that will vary depending on your race length, what the climate's like, whether you've had breakfast, that sort of thing. But these are some guidelines for you, so without further ado, let's get into the main chunk. Now let's quickly run through hydration, what it is and how it actually works. Now we're not specifically talking about exercise here, we're just talking in general. And the first thing to say is that blood contains a large amount of water, and that's where we get the volume from in our blood. Now your body has some super clever mechanisms at play, which helps to regulate how much you pee, what your blood pressure is, and this involves hormones, it involves electrolytes, receptors to know what kind of pressure is in your arteries. There's loads going on. And your body will just naturally regulate things, which is why sometimes you'll pee more, pee less, depending on your activity levels, how much you've drank, how much you've eaten. And that's just on a normal day-to-day basis. Now when it comes to exercise, this is also important. When we exercise, we'll often sweat, and that's one of the body's ways of cooling us down. And that's great because we don't want our core body temperature to rise because we know that's detrimental for so many different reasons. But it's important when we think about hydration because when we sweat, the end result is that we lose blood volume and we lose something called sodium, otherwise known as salt. And that's why our sweat tastes salty. It's because there's loads of sodium in it. And it is important to try and minimize the amount of dehydration we get because as we get dehydrated, some of our body systems stop working as well as they should. And that could be detrimental from a health point of view, but also a performance point of view. But we know that this is actually really quite individual and everyone can tolerate a different amount of dehydration before they show signs of it. So the aim is to minimize dehydration by drinking water. And this is one of those things which is really important to say, is that it's not just drinking water. It's drinking water that contains salt or sodium. And that's because remember when we sweat out sodium. So we lose some of it, but we need it within our body to help regulate different systems. So it's so important to just make sure that you drink water and salt. However, a little bit of dehydration isn't a bad thing. And our aim is not to not become dehydrated. Did I get that right? Not to not become dehydrated? Yeah, okay. We can tolerate a little bit of dehydration. And actually from a performance point of view, that would be pretty difficult to try and replace everything we've lost because we'd end up having to drink a lot and probably wouldn't go down very well. So we need a bit of a middle ground. Now, if you look at some of the guidelines out there, or you don't have to and I'll tell you instead, but in terms of dehydration, they suggest that you shouldn't lose more than 2% of your body weight. Now, how useful is this and is it actually realistic? Well, the answer there again is that it's quite individual, but it's generally a pretty good starting point. Now, before moving on, there are two things which you need to know. Firstly, when we talk about weight loss when it comes to exercise, at least from a hydration point of view, we are assuming that 1 kilogram of weight loss is 1 litre lost of sweat. So you lose 1 kilo, you've lost a kilo of sweat. And the second thing is that when we sweat, our salt could contain anywhere between about 200 to 2000 milligrams of sodium in it. And again, that's one of those really individual things. And I am going to do a video soon on how to tell if you're a salty sweater. So if you're interested, then you can just press that subscribe button. So the first bit of advice when it comes to hydration with a triathlon is to make sure that you go in hydrated. Now, I mentioned this in the carbohydrate loading video, but you need to make sure that you're staying hydrated while you're carb loading. And you definitely should be carb loading, by the way. So watch that video if you haven't, because I explain how to do it properly and the one big thing that most people miss. But let's assume that you're going into that triathlon in a hydrated state. So now there are 3 possible options for you. The first option is to use just a standard electrolyte replacement drink. And it will say something like use 1 or 2 sachets or tablets or whatever it is per 500 mils or per litre of fluid. And that's a great starting point. You can either drink to thirst or you can preempt it a little bit and try and give yourself a set guidance like 500 mils per hour. It's not particularly scientific, but it should stand you in reasonably good stead. Now, if your race is under 2 hours, then it's unlikely that actually hydration or dehydration is going to be a particularly big determinant of your performance, especially if you're going into it hydrated. But the longer the race is, the more important hydration becomes. If you are a salty sweater or you're racing in a warm environment, then you're likely to need somewhere between 1000 to 1500 milligrams of sodium per litre of water. Now, the second option that you've got available is to weigh yourself before and after exercise and see what the difference is. So for example, you do a big bike session on the turbo and you've weighed yourself before and then you weigh yourself again after. And you've just got to make sure that you factor in any fluid that you drink. So if you drink 500 mils of water, then you can assume that's an extra 500 grams. So you just take that off. How much weight did you lose? Now remember that assumption that we talked about at the start, which was 1 kilo of weight loss equals 1 litre of sweat or fluid loss. This is actually a really useful thing to do, especially, as I said, if you are interested and keen in making sure that your hydration is as good as possible. You could do multiple different sessions and record your weight changes, and you could do it at different powers, different paces, different temperatures, record all of the data like your power and your heart rate. And that way you can get an understanding of how much you sweat at that certain intensity. And that will give you a really good ballpark number, which you can then use to make your own hydration plan going into a tri. So as an example for you, let's say a 70 kilo athlete did a bike session and they lost 1 kilo of weight, which represents a 1.4% loss in body weight. Same athlete does a longer, harder session and they actually lose 2 kilos of weight. That's a 2.85% weight loss. How important are these numbers? Well, it's hard to say exactly, and it could be that actually it makes no difference at all to the athlete's performance. But in order to make up for that 2.85% weight loss and get it more in line with the 2% weight loss guidance, you'd need to drink about 500 mils of fluid, because that would mean about 1.5 kilos of weight loss and will get you closer to that 2% mark. Now remember, before I did say that you need to make sure that you take off the amount of fluid that you've drank when you're practicing and experimenting to see what kind of weight loss you've got during exercise, and you do need to do that, but when it comes to actually replacing the amount of fluid that you've lost, obviously you don't need to then. Now this method does take a bit of effort. It takes a bit of time, practice, prep, and it can be a bit fiddly. But if you are interested in your hydration and making sure it's as good as possible, then it's a really good thing to do. Now the third option that you've got available to you is to see a registered sports nutritionist or dietitian, because they'll be able to assess you properly, see what your sweat rate is, see what the concentration of your sweat is, so the sodium concentration of your sweat, and make a personalised, tailored plan for you. Or the other option is to look at one of the companies which do sweat tests, where they send you a kit at home and then you send it off and get the results. I mean, is it necessary for most people to do that? And the answer is that it's probably not, but that does depend on how much effort you're willing to put in and what kind of race you're doing. But to sum it up with some clear guidance for you. As a rule of thumb, if you know your exercise is going to last for longer than 2 hours, then a good starting point is 500 mils of water per hour, which contains 500 milligrams of sodium per litre. So that would be 250 milligrams of sodium in 500 mils of fluid. If you're a saltier sweater or you're racing in a hot environment, then you're probably going to need more sodium and probably a bit more fluid, but somewhere in the realms of 1000 to 1500 milligrams of sodium per litre of water. And if you want to go more in depth, then you practice. You weigh yourself before and after sessions. You keep a log of your pace, your power, your intensity, your heart rate, all of that kind of thing. And you be a bit of a nutrition nerd. And you create a plan based on that. But you absolutely do need to practice, and you need to also then make sure that you add in your carbohydrates as well to make sure that you can tolerate it all. And if not, what you can tolerate. And that brings us to the end of today's video. I hope you liked it, I hope you found it useful, and as always, let me know if you've got any questions in the comments or if you've got any feedback, as I'd love to hear it. And as always, if you haven't already, I'd really appreciate it if you gave the video a like, that thumbs up button, and press subscribe if you haven't already to stay updated whenever I release a new video. And I will catch you next time when we're going to talk about how to train your gut, because it's a thing that we can actually do. So I'll see you then.